Wasn't that fantastic? He is so good. We're going to start the panel sessions now, and if you are interested, the presentations, which you're going to see now, are going to be posted on www.ivres.org. And the full speaker bios are also on the same website, www.ivres.org. So we also invite you to follow us. We are into social media here, on Twitter at capital I, capital V, capital R, Renewables. So please do so. And with that, Jonathan, we'll just let you take panel A. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. Our topic, and I'm delighted to say we're right on time, California's energy future, statewide initiatives and perspectives. Very narrow topic. Four very good panelists. Let me introduce them quickly because I really want to get to the substance. To my immediate left, Karen Douglas, originally appointed to the California Energy Commission by Governor Schwarzenegger back in 2008, reappointed by Governor Brown. You actually were the chair for about a 2-year period from 2009 to 2011. Karen fills, the CEC has different buckets, and Karen fills the lawyer slot. Very active on the DRECP, the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, worked a lot on federal stimulus programs very successfully. Previously was at the Environmental Defense Fund, the Planning and Conservation League, and degrees, I'm happy to say, from Stanford Law School, as well as from University of Colorado, Boulder. Kevin, to Karen's left, all of you know, most of you know Kevin, General Manager of IID. Been with IID for almost a decade, I think, Kevin, General Manager since 2011, lifelong resident here, USC graduate with majoring in communications, actually has written quite a bit as a freelance writer, editorial page editor of the Imperial Valley Press. To Kevin's left, Angelita Galidova, a member of the Cal ISO Board of Governors. So ask her lots of questions on transmission. Angelina's been on the Board of Governors since 2011. And you're in your second term, I think, which expires next year. Previously, Executive Director of Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, Power Analyst at the New York Power Authority, and a graduate at Pace University Law School with lots of degrees, JDs, LLMs, all that kind of stuff. I don't mean to belittle it, I'm just jealous. John White. John, you're UC Riverside, if I recall? Yes. UC Riverside graduate. Real leader of the Green Movement for 35 years. He's the Executive Director of CERT, the Center for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Technologies. Full disclosure, I'm the chairman of CERT. I co-chair it with Ralph Cavanna of NRDC. CERT has been around for about 25 years. Really, it's a marvelous private-public consortium. You've got developers together with Union of Concerned Scientists and Sierra Club and NRDC really working on really the brains behind a lot of where California is today in its renewable energy policies. John did work in the legislature, helped to draft the California Clean Air Act actually, and worked on many of the statutes we have today, AB 32. The most important, the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006, and really involved in virtually all environmental legislation for the last several decades. We're all young, but these go on for decades. So let's get started. I have a couple of questions, but I want the panel to, I want as much interaction as we can, and start thinking of questions from the audience as well. But for starters, Karen, you're as a CEC commissioner, well, we heard earlier today, Imperial County's got its general plan. They've got a general plan amendment. They've got a South Salton Sea plan. I found an alternative general plan. I found a geothermal and transmission element update. There's a critique of the DRECP. This is a county that has really taken a very hard look at its own planning process. So I guess my question for you, number one, tell us about the DRECP in general for those who don't know about it, but then zero in on Imperial. What does Imperial County's future look like through the lens of your work on the DRECP?
All right, well, thanks for that question. I'll be brief on the DRECP, and actually we made a pretty big announcement earlier this week on how we're proceeding on the DRECP. The DRECP is part of the state's effort to, through partnerships with local government and federal government agencies as well, help put in place the planning framework for both mitigating the impacts of mitigating climate change by reducing emissions and also increasing resiliency and our ability to deal with the impacts of climate change itself on the natural environment and on our way of life in California. And so the DRECP is a large planning process. It's been going on for over 5 years now, involving the California desert, about 22.5 million acres in all, of which 10 million acres is public land, and within which there are all or part of 7 counties. And the purpose of this is to both identify the best opportunity areas for renewable energy, where projects can be developed at generally lower environmental impact, and also put in place a conservation framework to achieve long-term conservation goals in this incredibly rich and diverse region, fragile region environmentally, in a region where there's a very high rate of endemic species. And so the counties have been key partners in this effort, and Imperial County has been a key partner in this effort in a number of ways. First, certainly by working collaboratively with us for the years of putting this together, and secondly, by taking on, through 2 planning grants from the California Energy Commission, the work of updating its, and I'm going to have to reach for the name of the plan, but its general plan with regard to alternative energy and transportation, and also open space and conservation in phase 2 of the grant. So earlier this week, along with the Energy Commission, along with Bureau of Land Management and the wildlife agencies we've been working with, announced that we are going to phase completion of DRECP. We're going to begin with the public land element, the Bureau of Land Management land, and move that ahead on first, and give ourselves more time to work with the counties and really ensure that we can achieve that level of integration and alignment that we're looking for between the local, state, and federal levels of this. And I'm really optimistic about our work with Imperial County. I think that it's gone very well. The county's really stepped up, and maybe later I'll talk about how the county stepped up on permitting as well. But it's been a very good partnership.
What's the legal status of the DRECP? Is it when final, is it going to be a zoning law? Is it going to be a master plan? It affects both federal and private lands. What's its legal nature going to be?
So the plan, the draft that went out on the street has 3 elements: a Bureau of Land Management land use plan amendment, and that's a process that BLM uses to change land use designations and inform land use decisions on land that they manage. And then under state and federal endangered species laws, a state natural community conservation plan and a federal general conservation plan. One of the things that we're doing with the phased approach is taking a look at really the range of options for completing the private land and permitting aspect of this, from working in a tailored way with each county and maybe coming to conclusions or approaches that look different in different counties. So certainly beginning with the public land piece, that's a land use plan amendment. The private land piece, we're in a place of dialogue in order to find the best way to achieve our joint objectives.
And what kind of deadlines are you looking at for finalizing that work, or in terms of public comment at least?
Well, the public comment period closed.
Right.
And we got 12,000 comments, and so we're really looking at moving the plan, the public land part of the plan, generally on the schedule that we had, but I've got to caveat that by saying that there are 12,000 comments. Some of them are very detailed. And some of the comments took advantage of a new tool that we have used really for the first time in this way, and it's called Databasin, and it provides an incredible amount of transparency on the actual data and information and models and analytics underlying the plan. People can go into that system and build their own maps and suggest things to us, and a lot of people actually did. So we've got a very different level of comments as well.
You've been heavily criticized by wind developers. Talk about that a little bit, and talk about where geothermal settles out in this plan, because I think that's of great interest to Imperial County.
So this plan assumes, I'm going to start with geothermal. This plan assumes actually quite a lot of geothermal development. This plan is pretty aggressive, and I shouldn't say this plan. When we developed a set of assumptions about what might be built in the DRECP area, we looked at relatively high levels of geothermal, and that was in some ways as much a function of policy interest as it was. It certainly wasn't necessarily a prediction of what will happen, but we have some of the best geothermal development areas in the state and the country here in Imperial Valley. Geothermal has a lot of advantages. It's an important technology, and so we certainly hope to see geothermal contributing pretty significantly going forward. In terms of wind and other technologies, I think that we just need to be, we need to first of all continue the dialogue, secondly recognize the importance of technological diversity in running our system. It's great to have photovoltaic, we also need solar thermal with storage, we also need wind, we also need geothermal. It's really a mix in terms of bringing the system together. And one of the best things about the California desert is that it actually has an abundance of all these resources. Some of the best wind, some of the best geothermal, certainly some of the best solar in the world as well.
I don't want to monopolize the question. I would like to move on, but let me just ask the other three. Do you have other points, other comments you want to make now on DRECP, or shall we move on? I was going to go to Kevin, but I think I want to go to Angelina next, given the transmission question we've had, and maybe we'll, I think, starting at the top with statewide policy folks and then drilling down. The watchword in California, Angelina, has been flexible capacity, flexibility. And there's some who have gone so far to say Cal ISO is I mean, look, you've got to keep the lights on. Where does geothermal fit in that concept of flexibility? Are you looking at, have you got too much wind and solar? Are you trying to correct? Comment on that general issue of the base load versus flexibility problem and what that's meant for geothermal.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me here. It's always great to come to Imperial, and I enjoy it greatly. And with respect to transmission and with respect to reliability, the ISO is very concerned with reliability. This is our #1 objective. And of course, we want to meet the policy goals of the state. Until recently, the policy goal of the state was 33%. And how do we incorporate, 33% into the mix? We're well on track of meeting the 33%. Everybody went gung-ho, and we ended up with the duck chart. We have an issue with the duck chart because if you have too much renewables at a certain time of day, we end up having overgeneration, and nobody wants the C word, which is curtailment. So what do we do not to be able to curtail? And what happens if we move into the future and if we moved into a 50% scenario by 2030, and what happens beyond? Are we going to stop at 50? Are we going to continue further? How is the overall policy objective going to be shaped? Because, like your slide pointed out, having a boom and bust situation doesn't help anybody. Having no visibility into the future doesn't help anybody. All of us make infrastructure investments that are 20, 30, or longer period times with lifespans. So we need to make sure that we're looking beyond 2030, and we're looking into 2050, and what happens, and what do we need the system to look like? Right now, flexibility is a keyword. Yes, we need flexibility because we've got renewables and we need to be able to ramp up and down, and we need to be able to make sure we can optimize the renewables, and the EIM market and other new technologies emerging are going to be part of the solution. Taking it a step further and looking into a 50% scenario and maybe higher, your base load starts to become extremely important. If you're looking at a scenario that is predominantly renewables driven, geothermal becomes one of your most valuable resources. I know some of the plants can provide flexibility, which is great, and they should. But if you're looking at baseload renewables, nothing beats geothermal. Maybe a little bit biomass comes a little bit close, but geothermal should definitely be a part of the mix, and that long-term solution, that long-term visibility, that long-term supply of resources that's going to come to meet those goals of increasing renewables are going to have to include geothermal. I just read about Hawaii this morning. Hawaii is introducing a bill to go to 100% renewables by 2040. They currently have a bill of 70%. So going beyond the 50% is no longer pie in the sky bleeding edge goals. It's becoming a norm, and people are starting to look at how do we make that happen. If you have a geothermal resource, you're sitting on a mine of gold. So why wouldn't you exploit it, and why wouldn't you use it? It is certainly a technological mix, and it's certainly a resource we see that's going to be extremely valuable, and that we need to be incorporating into the mix sooner rather than later.
Take it to the next step. How, it's a chicken-egg problem here. How will that actually come to fruition? John White, you may want to jump in. From a policy point of view, it certainly makes sense. As I said, if renewables are the workhorse, they've got to be more than a niche. How do we get from here to there on geothermal? Because geothermal has lagged dramatically behind wind and solar. How do we get there?
You look at the situation again, and as you're moving forward with your carrots and your sticks, and as you're building your portfolio and your mix, like you do with transmission lines, you have a preference for reliability projects, you have a preference for policy-driven projects. You mesh your reliability and your policy together with a longer-term view, and you start saying, well, instead of investing in gas in the next 20 years, and I'm going to be stuck maybe with a stranded assets because I'm going to have an extremely aggressive greenhouse gas goal, what is the emission-free technology that I can rely as a base load to be able to move forward? And you start moving into a reliability base load supply that also is based on renewables and is based on geothermal. By default, if you're looking at a base load renewable 24/7, you don't have much of a choice.
So we're going to see somehow a 50% standard implemented, most likely by legislation, and then will the answer be procurement and utilities? You better wake up one day and stop buying all that wind and solar and look at baseload? Will it be in the procurement phase? Where will we see this magical geothermal renaissance?
I would think in the procurement phase, but also by pure economics to a certain extent, because if you're going into your cap and trade systems, and if you're going into 111D and the constraints and the additional constraints we see coming onto fossil fuel and coming onto the ability to be able to emit more greenhouse gases. If you're squeezing the bubble, so to say, and you have a platform of resources left, geothermal becomes a more and more prominent player and starts coming up. So I think, yes, a combination of thou shalt purchase, because we're going in that direction, and also this is a technology whose time has come. Mm-hmm. And we're going to be able to supply geothermal cheaper than gas. Why not do it? And it's a local resource, it's a reliable resource, you're not dependent on pipelines coming from outside and constraints. It's something that we can develop. We have it in abundance, and having again, like I said, 24/7 reliable baseload is important.
Let me switch gears on you a little bit, especially on that reliability question and cost. You spent considerable time looking at other countries' energy challenges in renewables, especially Germany. I'll read one day folks saying, let's develop renewables, let's not become like Germany. And then I read, let's emulate Germany. Germany, a country that is now about 27% renewables, moving a little bit backwards because of Chancellor Merkel's decision to close the 22 nuclear plants, which are emissions-free, so therefore getting more coal into the system. But that aside, I guess the question I have for you is, what have you observed? What lessons can we learn from, especially from Germany, as California tries to increase that percentage of renewables? What's the good news? What's the bad news?
Okay, well, I think it's mostly good news, and I'm biased towards Germany because I have worked with Germany, and I worked on their feed-in tariff and how the feed-in tariff came to be. And the most important point that the Germans made, and they were the first ones to do it. So kind of as a global community, we have to be grateful to the Germans for driving the price of renewables down. Because by having such an aggressive program, they kind of did a social good for everybody else and reduced the overall cost of renewables, which we're all benefiting from. We would not have the 6-cent PPAs we have here, but for Germany and then China jumping into the mix. So the Germans took a long-term view. Yes, it was an economic development idea initially to bring East Germany and West Germany together and have a more industrialized approach and kind of dominate a global market that was emerging. And they came up with supporting renewables. And they did a very thoughtful program, which basically said we need to guarantee investment. We have to have visibility 20 years ahead. We will guarantee returns on the investment, and we will have a very stable investment environment so that people can get into it. Kind of the TLC approach, transparency, longevity, consistency, no bum and bust, and they didn't play with tax credits, which was also good because nonprofits were able to participate and you didn't have to do these games of having a tax credit partner come in. So they did a very thoughtful program. They adjusted the feed-in tariffs based on technologies because they didn't want to pick technological winners. Did they pay more in the beginning? Of course they did. They paid about 50 euro cents a kilowatt hour for every solar kilowatt hour generated. But over time, they had a visibility and they said, we'll pay 50 cents, then we'll pay 40 cents in the next 3 years. If you come in 3 years later, we'll pay you 30 cents. And guess what? Every 5 years, we're going to adjust that amount downwards in order to be able to keep with the market. But we'll always guarantee a reasonable return on investment. And the technology is developed. The industry is developed. Germany is one of the leaders globally supplying these technologies, and they haven't suffered economically because of it. And it has created an environment of more renewables coming into Germany, owned primarily by individuals and farmers, as opposed to here, the large-scale projects. 80% of the projects in Europe are under 1 megawatt in size.
Under 1 megawatt.
Under 1 megawatt, and they're owned by individuals, not corporations. So it was a social investment. People said, well, hey, look, if I have a guaranteed investment of 50 cents a kilowatt hour for 20 years, why wouldn't I put a solar system on my roof and export to the utility? And they also took away the interconnection issues. So they were very, very advanced in interconnection and making sure that people are able to monetize their investments. They made it popular and they had a boom, which is great. And they're continuing that much more, how should I say, much more strategically now, because they've saturated to the point of where they need to be strategic like us, where they locate the renewables and how. But in my opinion, it is a tremendous success story that has showcased how the technological price can come down. It has guaranteed independence. The Germans are very nervous about being dependent on fossils, particularly with everything that's happening in Russia. They want to phase out coal to the extent that they can. Everybody says, yes, the greenhouse gas emissions did increase because they shut down all their nuclear power plants, good for them. But also, they have exported. Most of the coal that Germany has generated has been for export because we can go into the EIM market and regionalism. The Europeans are very, very dependent on regional markets too. So because they're able to sell that cheaper power into markets outside of Germany, they increase that export. That is going to shrink in the next 3 years. They won't be able to do it because of the greenhouse gas regulations in Europe as well. So I think it's a momentary blip that we saw of an increase, and it's going to decrease. So you can say, we don't want to be like Germany because we don't want to be leaders and we don't want to do a social good for the rest of the world and bring down technological costs. Or you can say, good for them, let's follow and let's see what we can do to push this forward, because all of us as a global society benefit from more renewables and technologies that support them in order to have a carbon-free grid.
Your last point actually suggests an answer to my next question, which is, why did Germany use the feed-in tariff approach primarily? California used a completely, I mean, yes, we looked a little bit at feed-in tariff, but used primarily an RPS approach.
Yeah.
Why did those two jurisdictions pick the system they did? I think your answer on feed-in is really more of a social good there and really push technology as opposed to get us to a 20%. I don't know, but let me turn it back to you.
Well, I mean, it's again, the Germans didn't have a specific goal in mind in terms of we want to have 20 or 30%. We're just going to have a market approach. We're going to give people the tools and let it end up where it ends up. And interestingly enough, we're very similar in where we've ended up as California with the portfolio standard, where Germany is right now. So both approaches have produced similar results, except in Germany, it's mostly individual owned by the individuals and maybe some aggregated individuals coming together. Here we have more of large-scale projects. Certainly we have rooftops as well in a different program and distributed DG, but that's also an issue of space. They don't have enough space in Europe. You cannot, a 5 megawatt project there is considered an awesome project. You don't see many 100 megawatt projects or larger. Maybe in wind, distributed somewhere, but certainly not in solar. So it's geographic to a certain extent, and it's resource constraints. But we've had similar developments. Our goals are very similar in terms of greenhouse gas reductions. So it's going to be beneficial for us to coordinate and collaborate with our European partners to a certain extent, because we have very similar challenges in terms of how do you integrate more renewables, how do you dispatch, how do you run your regional markets, how do you collaborate with your neighbors, and how do you make the resources available when they're needed. Norway and Switzerland supply a lot of hydro resources, and they're seasonal. Germany and some other countries supply a lot of renewables, and they're balanced by the hydro resources in other countries. Poland sometimes just completely cuts everybody else off and says, we have contracts for coal, your renewables cannot come here, and they push it back, disrupting everybody's grid operation. So they've got challenges and they've got opportunities, but they're working like us, like the ISO, to create the regional markets and to make sure that there's collaboration. So they've been a little bit more aggressive in incorporating more renewables on the distributed side. We've been more aggressive in incorporating renewables on the transmission side. And I'm happy to say that the ISOs in Europe and our ISO in California are starting to collaborate on what lessons have we learned, what can we do to improve, and let's come up with a solution instead of everybody individually reinventing the wheel, something we can work together and push it faster.
I want to come back to you with actually that very question, both of lessons learned in the past, but moving forward to a 50% level, what will those challenges be for the ISO? But let me turn to Kevin. Kevin, everyone's talked about saltancy, geothermal's been there, two big words, two big concepts. Where does the saltancy and specifically geothermal development fit into this future of 50% renewables for California?
Well, I'll get to that. First, I want to say how happy I am to be here, and I trust that you're all having a good conference. I'll fix that. I do want to sort of meander back to the saltancy. I'm sure that's a shock to all of you. But what I really like to talk about is California. I saw an op-ed today in the Times by your fellow Governor Dave Olson,
And Hookja.
and yours from CEC, whose name is more difficult for me to pronounce.
Hookja.
Thanks very much. And the subject was the RPS success story, and I think it has been a success story. And I join with everyone else, I think, in commending the job all of you have done, and all of you generators have done in working toward the 33% mark. California is a wonderful state, and it has a particularly grand place in the Union. It's this progressive tradition. And we saw something very much like that in the governor's announcement on the 50-50-50. I spoke I guess it was a year ago now, to the Southern California Association of Government. And they were having a General Assembly or something. And I talked to them about Imperial County's and IID's Salton Sea Restoration and Renewable Energy Initiative, and enlisted their help. And I commented to them that I could remember being a student in Los Angeles many years ago, where there were only 5 or 6 days a year that were quintessentially clear. Sort of beautiful postcard Southern California weather. The rest of the time it was smog. And it's not that way anymore. I just saw a news item last week that said that there's been an appreciable, discernible improvement in air quality in the Los Angeles basin. And that's because government made it happen. Took a long time, and it happened. So what's achievable in California is dictated by what's politically possible. And I would submit to this panel, and by the way, Angelina, you're now my favorite ISO Board of Governors member. I would submit that the Salton Sea can be fixed if there's a political will to develop the resource that's unique to the Salton Sea. I don't go in for this running debate on whether or not there's a problem with the ozone or greenhouse gas reductions. On the water side, I see it every day. So here in Imperial County, here at IID, we deal with a plunging elevation at Hoover Dam that will ultimately, if it continues, affect power generation. In California, I don't need to tell you that we're dealing with changed climate. So at the Salton Sea, for those of you who aren't just visiting but actually live here, we have something similar right where we live. And that's because the Salton Sea is going to be smaller. And as it grows smaller, it's going to become more emissive. And the water energy nexus that both of your boards wrestle with every day, the secret to solving it is right at the Salton Sea. And with that teaser, I'll open it up to you, Jonathan. And what was your question, by the way?
Well, you've approached it, but keep going. You've got the teaser, solve the problem, and solve it in the context of how to put some puzzle pieces together. Talk about Salton Sea restoration, but talk about it in the context of renewable energy solutions as well. Try that out.
So the RPS, and I think you hinted at it, Jonathan, in your talk, the RPS was actually spawned by AB 32, right? So it was carbon reduction, it was air impacts, it was emissivity. And I think this new 50% mark that we're talking about today, I'm sure it's going to create a new window for, all of the developers. And don't kid yourself, the solar people aren't going anywhere, and they'll be at the front of the line. And you know what? That's fine. But it's climate that we need to return to. And 50%, I'm all for it as a citizen of California. California should lead. Why stop now? But as a public power provider, we've got to meet that 50% like everybody else. The difference with us is that virtually all of the renewable resources that we've procured are right here where we live. And we will do the same thing with geothermal. We'll be a buyer of geothermal, and I hope that everybody else is too. So in answer to your question, Jonathan, the RPS came about as a result of this same progressive tradition on air. I think that we'd be best served returning to that mindset.
You noted, half in jest, but probably not, Angelina being your new best friend at the Cal ISO Board of Governors.
I actually was not kidding about that.
Okay. Zero jest.
I sure hope so.
The bar was very low, though.
Well,
You don't have friends?
you anticipated my question. Talk about the challenges IID faces with Cal ISO. What are some of the issues? What should be addressed? I don't like one should be diplomatic on these panels. I'm not trying to be undiplomatic. What are the challenges? What are the issues, and what kind of solutions? What would you like to see?
Well, thank you, Jonathan, for that softball question. I actually think that IID has shown, since the RPS in California came about, that it can work cooperatively with the ISO. But it's not just procurement that guides transmission, that influences load. It's also deliverability out of our own balancing authority. So there's some dispute about how much deliverability IID could offer today. If tomorrow morning there were a new 50 megawatt plant at the Salton Sea, and I'd submit to you that if you really wanted to fill the vacuum created by San Onofre, the void in the wake of that closure, that if you started today, you could do it all at the Salton Sea, and it wouldn't have to be all geothermal either, because as that lake recedes, you could end up with the world's largest industrial park there in the southern section of the Salton Sea. And if California is going to be serious about dealing with the real problem that exists there, then that's the way we'll all cooperate together, and we'll solve it.
All right, we'll come back to that as well. I'm about to really kill a metaphor here, but John White, in baseball terms, you're batting cleanup. Cleanup batters get to pick their pitches, especially when they've got runners on base, so you've got 3 good runners. I almost hesitate to ask you a specific question. I've also never seen you been this quiet for such a long period of time on any panel, anywhere. I'm just going to open it up to you. Pick, respond, talk? I mean, generally, obviously, from a policy point of view, would like to know how we're going to get from here to there on these goals, but the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me again. I always enjoy coming to Imperial. It feels like I'm more grounded both in the problems and in the solutions and the wonderful people in this community. I wish more people from Sacramento would come down here and
Can you hear in the back?
spend time, particularly in the winter. I also share, I grew up in Pasadena, and I share Kevin's memories about how bad the smog was and how intractable it seemed. And I think his metaphor is a good one, because I think it's really an example of what we can do when we put all of our minds together and work on it. But it requires strong direction and strong policy, and I think one of the things that characterized California's recent progress in history is we've kind of done it through a series of almost random acts that were not really connected to each other. And you pointed out, Jonathan, we had a lack of planning. We basically set these goals, 1 million solar roofs, 33% RPS, improvement of air quality and climate change, and we carried these out really through a series of discrete policies. And we've been amazingly lucky, I think, that it's gone as well as it has. But the truth is, we're going to have to move forward with a more integrated approach that looks at multiple goals, multiple strategies, and coordinated planning. It's too bad that our friend Jim Avery's not here to explain why come it is that his portfolio includes no geothermal, despite all the advertisements for Sunrise when it was being built. And I think this gets to the problem of what are you trying to solve for? The Renewable Portfolio Standard was, at the time, a fairly radical proposal that was heavily opposed and resisted and took several years to put in place. At one time, it was thought that California would import almost all of the renewable energy from the Northwest and Wyoming. And there was a strong pushback from the labor community and the environmental community and the consumer community that says, well, why are we paying for all this stuff when we're not getting benefits to California? And so we ended up with a fairly complicated scheme that emphasized in-state development. I don't think that impulse is going away. I don't think there will be political support for expanding climate and renewable energy goals unless there is a link to economic development and jobs, okay? But the second thing is that RPS has been kind of because it was a regulatory program, the emphasis was on compliance in the near term. How many kilowatt hours did you buy this year and next year? As well as avoiding penalties. And then finally, being very conscious of costs. Ironically, the big risk of the RPS was supposedly it's going to increase costs. And so we put all these belts and suspenders on to do cost containment. PUC staff micromanaging the RPS in their fashion, and I wish Angelina's sentiments were shared by some of her colleagues at the PUC, because the PUC staff has basically had blinders on and said, geothermal's too expensive, and it isn't flexible. And so we're going to keep buying more PV. And yet that same group of people has no concept for how we're going to manage all of this curtailment that's going to come about. So I think in the end, it's likely that we will have a backbone renewable requirement on the way. But the other thing is, it's not just 50%. If we're serious about climate change, we have to decarbonize the grid. That means 80% and more by 2050, and the pathway to those numbers cannot be done without planning. We can limp along and keep doing the RPS like we're doing, and that's probably a good thing given the prices are low and buying more wind and solar is a fine thing. But if you're trying to manage the grid with the least carbon, you're going to want more transmission, you're going to want more geothermal, and you're going to want more bulk storage. Those are going to be the critical lessons. But if you're thinking at 33% in 2020 as your focal point, you say, I'm done. That's all I need to do. And because the utilities have treated renewables as a compliance obligation instead of a overarching strategy, they've chosen the simplest and the easiest things to buy. and that's been great. The cost of solar have come down. There is another narrative that is out there that geothermal isn't needed, even with low greenhouse gas emissions, because we're going to do it all with battery storage and solar. Maybe. Batteries,
Well, but
batteries are a great thing, but the fact is, when you think about trying to run the grid on the least carbon possible with the most economic benefits to the people of this state, you're going to need regional cooperation, you're going to need regional imports, but you're also going to need to really think about this as a whole system, and that we haven't done, and I think that's the road we're beginning to.
Well, let me pursue that with all of you, because the logical extension of what you're saying is that continuing an RPS-type system of here's a RF, here's a request for proposals, get a bid in, we'll get the price, win that contract, go to the next project. That scenario is something that does not meet your goal of better planning, and Karen certainly doesn't meet what the DRECP is generally all about. What's the answer? Because on the one hand, you can come back to a command and control, let government figure it out, which we generally don't like as a populace. We kind of like the idea of the more capitalist approach of developers go and try for projects. Where's the sweet spot there between overarching government planning and what we've had so far?
Let me just take a crack at that. I think what we need is a hybrid
Speak
system.
a little closer to the mic, by the way. I'm not
I
sure.
think what we need is,
Sorry,
excuse me.
not that close.
I think what we need is both a backbone renewable target that we can measure progress, probably with more flexibility than the current system, but sticking to those, that as a goal and as a target for 2030 and beyond. You can't get to greenhouse gas emission reductions of the kind that we want without renewables as the strategy. But I think we need to add a greenhouse gas target that will put us on the path to 2050 and have that be a driving force in grid planning, so that, you know, our friends at the ISO to this day still stop at 2020. It's one of the reasons that the transmission down here doesn't look like it's needed, because we don't need it for 33, and until the PUC tells them to study something else, they stop at 2020. When you look beyond 2020 to 2030 and beyond to 2050, the game plan becomes more clear, and yet our current statutory planning framework stops at 2020. So at a minimum, whatever we do, combination of renewables and GHG, it needs to be interim and long-term.
Angelina, is that a fair statement? Why don't you respond?
Yes, and it's true. It's going to be a much more intensive and a much more collaborative process where you need to have visibility into systems beyond just the ISO system. And it's wonderful that we're collaborating with the IID. We've got visibility into their system, and that will be an opportunity to enable us to work together much more closely and put us on a path of integrating more renewables from the IID area. I mean, you've got the best solar resources, the best geothermal, and the best biomass. Why not utilize that? I can't imagine that it's not going to be one of the lowest cost solutions. But as John pointed out, yes, it's true. The planning horizons are very short, and now we're looking at 2030. And 2030 with a 50% is a totally new ballgame. We don't know what it is, but we do want to make sure that it's not as prescriptive as the RPS. And you're not only looking at electricity when you're looking at the greenhouse gas emissions. You also need to tackle the transportation sector. 43% of your greenhouse gas emissions come from vehicles on the freeways. So how do we approach that issue? And of course, being challenging is also an opportunity, because electric vehicles, transportation being a part of the solution, transportation fleets providing a sink for the overgeneration, being able to have the vehicle to grid charging solutions is very important, being able to have demand response and aggregators, and people who are able to optimize energy efficiency becomes more and more critical. How do we work together with industries we've never traditionally worked with and integrated as closely before, like the transportation sector, like the IT sector, because that's going to be driven very much into the area of demand response, and how do we all make sure that these solutions come together in a way that is least cost, best fit for everybody? And We haven't thought in that perspective. We're starting to, for the very first time, and analyzing the opportunities, which means we need to talk with electric vehicle manufacturers, with battery manufacturers. Bulk storage is critical. If you can have a pumped hydro facility providing you generation and storage of thousands of megawatts, why not? We've got 13,000 megawatts of ramping up and down we need to be doing every day according to the duct chart. And that's only by 2030. If we go further, it becomes more. So all of these technologies have to come in and play together, and we need to start looking at all of them, and we're not right now. It's all piecemeal. And it's something that needs to start to change with the energy principles meetings. I think it is starting to, but more players need to be around the table.
So I'm just going to step in and add that, I don't think the Dear ECP speaks to this question. It doesn't speak to what we procure. It doesn't speak to how we procure it. It's about permitting and conservation opportunities and constraints, and it provides useful information, but it doesn't really tell us, should we have an RPS? Should we move to a more climate-focused framework? I do know that we have had a lot of success in meeting the RPS targets that the state has set for itself over time. We have met our target of 20% renewable energy by the end of 2013. We've already exceeded the target of 25% renewable energy by the end of 2016. We are likely to significantly exceed the target of 33% by 2020, and some people think that we might find ourselves at 40% by 2020. So there's no question that the RPS has been an extremely successful tool in helping the state set and meet quantitative renewable energy goals. And I think the question before us is, given the challenges of moving to 50% and beyond, do we need to integrate additional kinds of framework, kinds of ideas and frameworks so that we can ensure that we achieve the system integration that we're going to need at those higher levels?
Before opening up to questions, I want to, from the audience, and do start thinking of questions, folks. I want to come back to Kevin for a second. You talked at possible solutions for salton sea restoration. I guess my question is, well, maybe the direct question, Kevin, is you're dictator. Do you need legislation, specific legislation, to advance some of these salton sea restoration ideas, or is it a matter, as you said, of just political will? If you could wave the magic wand, what would happen?
Well, we've already proved that I'm not capable of waving a magic wand, because I've been at this for the better part of 2 years and have gotten very little traction. But something will happen at the Salton Sea this year. And it will either be very positive for the people who live in the Imperial or Coachella valleys, or it will be very chaotic for the state of California. But in 2017, that mitigation water that the Salton Sea has relied on for the first 15 years of the nation's largest agricultural to urban water transfer goes away. And the Salton Sea falls off the cliff at that point. So what the people who live here most need is a bona fide partner. And in that grand tradition of progressive, enlightened public policy, California needs to step up and be that partner.
You talking the governor's office? You talking the John Lairds of this world? Is it like the energy principles getting together?
I think all of the above. Mm-hmm. But there's an urgency that attaches to this issue that you really don't feel unless you live here. And what I'm suggesting to this audience and this panel is that we're going to do our best to make everybody feel it in 2015.
Let me open up to questions. We've covered a whole range of areas. There's got to be questions from the audience. Yeah, in the front. Wait for the mic.
Geothermal is very expensive to develop, and you're not talking about the financing of it. what needs to be done to increase the financing or make the companies that develop geothermal more comfortable about investing?
You need a procurement strategy that isn't based on least cost, best fit. You need a procurement strategy that folds in the tangible benefit that comes with a resource that's virtually emission-free.
Let me just add that the proverbial level playing field doesn't exist. The solar guys are able to bid 6 cents and get paid 8 because they get a time and delivery bonus for delivering their power in the middle of the day. We said that some of this problem with financing geothermal is that it is thought to be more expensive than it actually is. We know of bids that have been delivered below 10 cents, okay, for new geothermal. So it's not a question of being too expensive. It's more expensive than solar, but solar is in some ways still living off of the earlier circumstance when there wasn't very much solar, when the middle of the day was when we had the most critical needs for power. And so we paid them 2 extra cents for showing up in the middle of the day. Okay, that was great. They deserved it. Problem is now, as we've heard, in the middle of the day, we're curtailing resources because we have too much. Okay, so this is an example of where we need a more flexible and thoughtful approach to the RPS. And I think, as Kevin said, we need to marry the procurement of our greenhouse gas reduction resources with economic development and environmental needs in the state. It's been said in some circles that emission reductions for greenhouse gas emissions don't matter where they occur. That we can save a rainforest in Brazil and do the same benefit as if we do emissions in California. But if you add air pollution emission reductions to the goals you're trying to pursue, and you talk about how do we have economic development go along with the achieving of these goals, then I think you end up with a different program. And yet utilities have bought, this administration, in my opinion, missed the opportunity with San Onofre to do more with renewables and preferred resources. They were afraid of the lights going out.
Let me interject, John, if I can. Lynn, you're a member of the working press. The only new resource that's been built at the Salton Sea for geothermal since California adopted its RPS is a 49 megawatt plant, and the off-taker is in Arizona. Matter of fact, after I'm done here, I'm going to drive out there. I'm going to check on how it's working out for them.
I'll add one quick footnote on that level playing field point. Geothermal, one reason geothermal is very popular is geothermal pays property taxes. That's good for local communities. Utility scale solar is exempt from California property taxes. That is hundreds of millions of dollars over the 30-year life cycle of one of these plants. You know, Angelina made this point, it was kind of a subtle one, but it's important. Utilities are not looking at 10-year horizons. They're looking at 30 and 40-year horizons. Or when you look at the relicensing of nuclear plants, 40-year horizons have become 80-year horizons. So that's another important differential.
And on that point, as I understand it, that property tax exemption ends up works out to about a penny a kilowatt hour. So if you have a 6 cent bid, you have a 2 cent bonus for time of delivery, you get a 1 cent exemption for property taxes, you're at 9 cents. So the idea that geothermal is wildly more expensive than solar just simply isn't true. Now, there's reasons to buy both. I don't want to make it the case that we don't.
Plus all that overgeneration that Angelina's talking about on the duct chart, you know, you have to dump that energy. What's that cost? Not that I have any strong opinions about it.
But this also gets to how we are using our natural gas, because a lot of the reason for the overgeneration problem is we've got a lot of self-scheduled gas on the system that isn't needed for reliability. That's sort of a legacy. So part of what we're going to have to do is true up our system to the multiple goals we're trying to achieve.
Right. And the legacy issue is important. And when you're starting to look into the future and the cost of what that decarbonized grid is going to be, geothermal looks awfully attractive. At 8 cents, 24/7 supply, that's actually not a bad deal, because if you're looking at a 24/7 supply of intermittent resources, you have to add the cost of storage. And what is that cost going to be? That's another adder that we don't know yet. Right now, we know it's super expensive, and we're okay, we can bypass it, because at the 33% level, it's not so critical. It's going to become more important at the 50%. And then it starts becoming more interesting. So if we're looking at those horizons, we should be looking at the overall value holistically, and storage needs to be incorporated into how we value intermittent resources as well. And then geothermal, I think, becomes a very interesting winner.
By the way, on the topic of natural gas versus renewables, I'm put on my utility hat for a second. We, take our Midwest utility that I was talking about earlier, we use renewables as a hedge for our customers, because we can pretty well pencil out the 30-year cost of a wind farm, because we know what the fuel cost is zero. If you look at the 30-year life cycle of a natural gas plant, combined cycle natural gas plant, about 80% of that cost generally is fuel. And nobody knows, you can't buy a contract for natural gas for more, without major hedging, for more than a couple of years. Geothermal developers will enter into 20-year contracts, 30-year contracts, because generally, and as will wind and solar, because you know the fuel cost. You don't know the fuel cost with natural gas.
Oh, but see, we have a solution for that in California, which is we don't think about the fuel costs. Right? What we do with the natural gas plants is we look at the capital costs,
Yep.
and it looks cheap. The reason that the utilities are so ready to buy gas is because they have no price risk on the downside. All of the future price risk for natural gas fuel increases are on the ratepayer.
Yep.
Okay, and there's no even 20% shared risk. It's all, so when you have what's called a tolling agreement, like the Carlsbad plant, that tolling agreement basically has the cost of the plant plus an index of what the future gas price is expected to be, but all of the risk for the future price increase is on the ratepayer and not on the utility. And that's one of the reasons that we've been so eager to buy so much gas.
Other questions? Yes, here. And wait for, if you, someone bring a mic, yeah.
Yes, I had a question related to the compliance instruments and the cost, or the use of the money of those compliance instruments, the credits that are bought for offset on greenhouse gas under AB 32. And since it's in the billions, or will be in the billions over the next few years of dollars available there, what portion or what allocation, if any, what earmarking is taking place towards renewable projects like Mr. Kelly's talking about that are near zero in their impact? And isn't that a potential funding source? And a part B to that is we allow offset credits. Now, that's a little more creative perhaps, but should there be some concept of offset credits, because you clearly are replacing what might otherwise be an emission for your production of energy that you're avoiding. So when we allow forests to be purchased, and it's kind of a comparable thing in terms of the benefit, if you will.
I want to thank my brother for that thoughtful question. So it's the cap and trade that he's asking about. I can tell you that at IID, we repowered a natural gas plant in the last couple of years. And the efficiencies that we realized just operationally were matched almost equally by the offsets that we realized. So I think we went up to, what is it, Carl, 149 megawatts? But the heat rate just came way, way down. And it's our El Centro what we used to call the steam plant. But to your question, if there were just a large-scale build-out of the geothermal resource at the Salton Sea, say it was 1,000 megawatts, what corresponding impact would that have on the air? I can't tell you, but I think it would be profound.
Other questions? I saw another hand. Yes, way on the other side. Wait for 1 second, and the gentleman front left table. White beard and red shirt.
Hi, I'm Rod Williams, Mesquite Lake Water and Power. I sit here and I'm in total amazement that there's not been one word spoken of conversion of trash to energy. I'd like for someone to address that.
There is, I think, an economic question about the relative cost effectiveness of particularly mass burn technology as a solution. But I think there is a lot of interest in converting methane from landfills into renewable fuels, and also dairy waste, which is a very significant source of methane pollution. I think bioenergy with those sources has a future. I think generally burning of trash is controversial because of its pollution impacts and because of the cost. On the other hand, as we get more sophisticated at separating waste out and reducing the plastics and the metals and the other things, you get a cleaner waste stream, and you have potentially, I think, a more economic product. So I think that's a technology that has had some ups and downs, but I think particularly the emphasis on methane is going to make capture of at least animal waste and other wastewater treatment gas, those applications I think are likely to be part of the solution, and I think an important contributor.
One last question. Yes, right in the middle.
Thank you. There's been a lot of discussion about larger projects, and I'm wondering if there's going to be any initiatives that might be addressed in the future to address like the existing facilities and smaller projects. Perhaps like cogeneration, trigeneration, just recovering heat, reducing load overall on the grid.
She's talking about new generation versus legacy.
Did you hear the question well enough? I did
She's
not.
talking about existing renewable projects?
You're-
She started with that.
Say, we didn't quite catch your, say the question into the mic a little more clearly, sorry.
No problem. Sound better?
Yes.
Okay, great. There's been a lot of discussion about these larger projects, solar, wind, geothermal, but I'm wondering if there is any major discussion about an initiative to address existing facilities as far as making them more efficient. I mean, these are smaller projects that encompass cogeneration, trigeneration. We're talking about food processing plants, hospitals, just industrial facilities across the board to reduce the load on the grid overall, because I figure that will also contribute.
I think the third leg of that stool that the governor announced in 50-50-50 was energy efficiency, right?
From buildings.
Yes.
And I think it was to come from exactly those sorts of projects.
Right. And another twist that we have is because there's also an initiative, we've got so many initiatives, like I said, it's a patchwork, the zero net energy construction, both for residential and commercial moving into the future. You're going to have a very interesting situation of now your building stock incorporating an energy generation and a storage element, and how is that going to fit in? And it also weaves into the economic development component, because if all of a sudden your roof, your facade, your window becomes a generator at whatever efficiency that is, you're not going to import that roof from far away. It's going to be locally manufactured. So by default, your smaller projects and your goals of zero net energy are going to lead to economic development, because you're going to want those windows, those facades, those roofs, those charging stations manufactured, installed, and maintained in state. So moving towards a cleaner building fleet and more energy efficiency leads to more jobs and economic development. And that's, I think, something we're going to see in the very near future developing, where it's not only going to be large-scale power plants that are developed, but based on microgrids, based on community, based on zero-net energy communities as a whole, you're going to see a shift towards local manufacturing of generation components, control, whether it's your nests, whether it's your new high-tech companies being able to incorporate your efficiency appliances into your home, being able to remotely tell your house cool now or warm up now, is going to be an opportunity for customers to be able to control their energy future and their energy destiny. And we were having a strategic retreat not so long ago with the ISO. We kind of stepped back and said, well, who are we doing this for? Who is ultimately the entity that we serve? And lo and behold, it is the customer. It's not the ratepayer, not necessarily the utility. It's the customer that's going to drive the future demand, and the customer wanting more control of their energy destiny. And that's going to lead to a much more flexible, a much more complicated, but a very exciting solution as well.
You know, and I'll just say, I think it's really important to note that these are all solutions that are moving forward in parallel. It's not first one, then the other. The states put a lot of resources into energy efficiency. The Energy Commission's been doing that for decades, but also small solar and community and microgrid applications, and that's critical. That's a really important part of meeting our goals and integrating renewables and building more resiliency into California's cities. And at the same time, we need to think about the system as a system. And you know, a lot of Californians live on the coast where you might get 85 or more cloudy days a year. So you can have solar on every building in the city, but when it's cloudy for a week, it doesn't help you that much. So you need to think about the system as a system. It's really the integration of what are the steps that are cost effective and make sense that we need to do to make this work in our urban centers, and where are there great renewable energy resources in the desert, in the Central Valley, in the West, in the Western interconnection, so that we can leverage the renewable energy potential and we can leverage the natural variability in when these areas generate and what resources are generating, so that we can reach our long-term climate and energy goals in a way that's cost-effective and on time, and continue to provide reliable electricity service to Californians. I mean, that's really fundamentally what this is about. And you know, it's not either or. It's really having to do these things in parallel, and increasingly, I think, in an integrated and thought-through way.
We're going to resume at about 11:05, but before taking the break, please join me in thanking this panel for a terrific discussion.
So I guess you're coming to Sacramento next week. See, I got an invite, so I'll be there talking about lunch. I'd love to talk to you before that.
Thank you. If you take a look at your badges,
Let's set some time the day before.
and at the bottom you may see the letters BANQ. And if you do, that means you're registered for the banquet this evening. If you're not registered for the banquet, that'll be held this evening directly after the Cali Baja Mega Region reception. Please visit the registration office and they'll set you up.
Kevin, always a pleasure. Yeah, good to see you.
At this time, I would like to thank the sponsors of the summit. Certainly without their financial support, this would not occur. The title sponsor is IID. Premier sponsor is the County of Imperial. Diamond sponsor is SDG&E. Platinum sponsor is Tenasca Solar Ventures, along with IBEW Local 569, National Electrical Contractors Association, San Diego Imperial Chapters, Desert Security Services, Gold sponsor is our good friends at California Ethanol and Power, Pattern Energy, Plumbers and Steel Fitters, San Diego Imperial County, Local 230, 8 Minute Energy, Renewables, Z Global. Silver sponsors include Cal Energy, AES, Cali Baja Binational Mega Region, and Erickson Grant, Inc. And the additional silver sponsors are Gestamp Solar, San Diego State Center of International Business, Education, and Research, our good friends over at Southern California Association of Governments, Geothermal Resources Council, Regenerate, and finally, the bronze sponsors are Best and Kruger, California Manufacturing Technology Consulting, Control Thermal Resources, Inc., Enterprise Rent-A-Car, First Solar, Inc., Laborers Union Local 1184, Procopio, Corey, Hargraves, and Savage, San Diego County Water Authority, Securitas Security Services, and Shepard Mullen. We're going to take a short break, and we'll see you in just a little while. Thank you.